The radar plot shouldn't have been climbing. That was the first thing wrong with it. At a little over 66,000 feet, the contact sat in a band of sky the controllers had quietly stopped worrying about. A ceiling so high that no fighter in NATO's inventory was supposed to reach it, let alone hold a man there long enough to do anything useful. The intruder cruised serenely above the weather, above the contrails, above the reach of every interceptor the West could put up. It was, by the polite fiction of the exercise, untouchable, and everyone in the chain of command from the radar cabin upwards believed it. Everyone except a flight lieutenant named Mike Hale, sitting on top of two Rolls-Royce Avons in an English Electric Lightning F.3, registration XR749, with a plan that the manufacturer's own performance tables said should not work. It was 1984. A major NATO air defence exercise was running over the North Sea and the eastern approaches to the British Isles, the kind of choreographed war the RAF rehearsed several times a year. Bombers in, fighters up, the whole apparatus of Cold War readiness tested against a simulated Soviet onslaught. Into this, almost as a dare, came a Lockheed U-2. The Dragon Lady, the most famous spy aircraft ever built, the aeroplane that had photographed Soviet missile sites in Cuba and been blown out of the sky over Sverdlovsk, flying at an altitude its crews regarded, quite reasonably, as a private sanctuary. The U-2 driver expected to drift across the exercise like a ghost, logged by radar, shadowed perhaps, but never genuinely threatened. He was there to be a problem the fighter pilots couldn't solve. Hale intended to solve it. What he was about to attempt was not interception in any orthodox sense. The Lightning could not fly level at the U-2's height. No aircraft in RAF service could. What it could do was something closer to a controlled act of violence against physics. Accelerate to the very edge of its speed at the tropopause, point the nose at the heavens, and trade every last knot for altitude in a screaming ballistic arc, a zoom climb, gambling that for a handful of seconds at the top of that parabola, with the engines starving and the controls going soft, he could put his aircraft and his gun camera precisely where the Americans swore he could never be. One pass, a few seconds of opportunity. No second chances because there was no fuel for them. Why does an obscure exercise intercept off the Yorkshire coast matter? Because the aircraft Hale was about to ambush was bound up with one of the most closely guarded secrets in post-war British history. A program that ran through Downing Street, through MI6, through dead pilots and forged identities, a thing successive governments would deny to Parliament for decades. The U-2 was never just an American problem. Britain had been entangled with the Dragon Lady from the very beginning, in ways the public would not learn for half a century. And on this particular day, the wheel was about to come full circle. The aircraft Britain had once helped fly in secret was about to be hunted down by a British fighter that wasn't supposed to be able to catch it. And the moment would be captured on film. The U-2 pilot had no idea what was rising towards him out of the murk below. Keep that thought. We'll return to that gun camera frame and to what it really meant. But to understand why this mattered, we have to go back. Back to a Britain that had just lost an empire and was frightened of the dark. To understand the Lightning, you have to understand the fear that built it. In the early 1950s, Britain was a nation that had won a war and was quietly losing the peace. The empire was unraveling. India already gone, the rest going, the humiliation of Suez waiting just over the horizon in 1956 to announce to the world that London could no longer act alone. The economy was exhausted, rationing a living memory, the Treasury permanently appalled at the cost of everything. And yet, across the North Sea sat a threat that made all of this seem almost beside the point: the Soviet Union and its rapidly expanding fleet of long-range bombers carrying nuclear weapons. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Britain was small, crowded, and close. A handful of Soviet bombers getting through could end the country as a functioning society in an afternoon. The chiefs of staff understood this with absolute clarity. The whole edifice of British defence policy in the atomic age rested on two pillars: a deterrent of our own, the V-Force, the Valiants, Vulcans, and Victors that would carry Britain's bomb to Moscow, and an air defence system capable of stopping enough incoming Soviet aircraft to matter. The first pillar threatened. The second had to protect, above all, the airfields from which the first would fly. This was the strategic soil in which the Lightning grew. The requirement was for an interceptor of almost absurd performance, something that could sit on the ground at readiness, scramble, and climb faster than anything else alive to meet high, fast Soviet bombers before they could release their weapons. Not a dogfighter, not a thing of subtlety. A guided missile with a man in it, in the memorable phrase of the era. A fighter conceived to do one thing supremely well: get very high, very fast, and kill the bomber before the bomber killed Britain. English Electric, at Warton, in Lancashire, had been working on exactly this since the late 1940s, when the project was still known by the unromantic designation P-1. The test pilot Roland Beaumont took the prototype supersonic in level flight, and on November 25, 1958, the P-1B became the first British aircraft to reach Mach 2. The performance figures that came out of the program were so extreme that the RAF treated the aircraft's true ceiling as a state secret, officially in excess of 60,000 feet, a deliberate understatement that concealed what the machine could really do when a bold pilot pointed it at the sky and held on. By the time the Lightning entered squadron service in 1960, the world had shifted again. The cabinet, now under Harold Macmillan, was wrestling with the staggering cost of remaining a first-rank military power, whilst the bills for everything else came due. The 1957 Defence White Paper, Duncan Sandys' notorious document, had already declared that the future belonged to missiles and that manned fighters were very nearly obsolete. A prophecy that would haunt British aviation for a generation and very nearly strangle the Lightning in its cradle. But the bombers kept coming, season after season, probing the edges of UK airspace, testing the reactions of fighter command. And so the Lightning flew, and kept flying, long after Whitehall had decided it shouldn't exist. It became the spear point of British air defence through the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. Into this same world, almost simultaneously, came another aircraft. Not British, not a fighter, but an instrument of the secret war being waged in the silence above the clouds. The Americans had built something that flew higher than anything the Lightning was meant to reach. And in the deepest secrecy, Britain decided it wanted in. The aeroplane was called the U-2, and it was a heresy in aluminium. Where the Lightning was all brute thrust, the Dragon Lady was a glider with a jet engine. Vast, fragile wings, a body built so light it had to be flown with the delicacy of a man carrying a full glass across a crowded room. It did one thing the Lightning could not. It cruised, steadily and for hours, at over 70,000 feet, in a realm so high the sky turns black at noon, and the pilot wears a pressure suit because his blood would otherwise boil. Lockheed's Kelly Johnson had built it for the CIA to do the unthinkable, to fly over the Soviet Union itself, photographing missile fields and bomber bases that no Western leader could otherwise see. And here is the part the British public would not learn for 50 years. This was not purely an American enterprise. From the mid-1950s, Britain was woven into it. The first U-2s in Europe arrived not in America's deserts, but on English soil, at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk in April 1956, smuggled in as components and assembled in a discreet hangar under the cover story that they were high-altitude weather research aircraft. The deception held for a while. Then it began to fray. A U-2 on a training flight was picked up by the British radar net, and Fighter Command, not in on the secret, scrambled jets to chase the mysterious intruder, an early, almost comic rehearsal of the cat and mouse to come. Worse, the Buster Crab affair, in which a frogman vanished beneath a Soviet cruiser in Portsmouth Harbour, poisoned Anglo-Soviet relations at precisely the wrong moment. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, alarmed, withdrew permission. The American detachment moved on, but the British appetite had been whetted. Under Macmillan, the relationship deepened into something extraordinary. In 1957, the Prime Minister personally agreed that RAF pilots would be trained to fly the U-2 on the CIA's behalf. A way of buying Britain a genuine stake in the intelligence and of spreading the political risk should an aircraft come down. 4 men were selected: Flight Lieutenants John MacArthur, David Dowling, and Michael Bradley, and Squadron Leader Chris Walker. They were sent to Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas to learn the Dragon Lady's lethal subtleties. The secrecy was total and the cover elaborate. The British pilots would masquerade as civilians employed by the Meteorological Office, with MI6 stage managing the deception. The whole apparatus had a code name, Project Oldster, and a commander in Group Captain Thomas Bingham Hall, a decorated wartime bomber pilot whose cover was the innocuous Meteorological Experimental Research Unit. Communications ran through the Air Ministry to the Cabinet Office itself. This was prime ministerial business conducted in the dark. Then, tragedy. On July 8, 1958, Squadron Leader Walker, the man marked to lead the British contingent, died on a training flight, his oxygen system choked with ice, his blood starved of air, his ejector seat failing as he fought a doomed aircraft down towards the Texas plains. The media smelled something. The Labour opposition tabled awkward questions in Parliament, and the government's response set the tone for everything that followed. The general policy here, Bingham Hall signalled, is to say nothing. Once you start explaining, he reasoned, you only invite people to prise the door wider. The policy worked. Britain flew the U-2 in secret, denied it for decades, and buried the files. The Dragon Lady became part of Britain's hidden Cold War. A machine the nation had helped to fly, mourned a man for, and lied about to its own parliament. Which makes what happened over the North Sea a quarter of a century later all the more remarkable. Because by 1984, the secret partner had become the hunter. By the 1980s, the Lightning was an old warrior in a young man's war. It had been condemned to obsolescence on paper before it ever entered service, kept alive by the simple fact that the threat it was built to counter refused to go away. The Soviet bombers still came. Through the long, taut years of the Cold War's final decade, Brezhnev giving way to Andropov, the able Archer scare of 1983 bringing the world closer to catastrophe than almost anyone realized at the time. The Lightning squadrons stood their quick reaction alert, ready to launch at minute's notice into the cold air over the North Sea to meet whatever Moscow sent west. The aircraft was, by then, a museum piece in the air and a marvel in the climb. Newer fighters had longer legs, better radar, smarter missiles. What none of them had was the Lightning's sheer, savage, vertical performance. Strip away the years and the limitations. the laughable fuel endurance, the short-ranged radar, the missiles that grew sluggish in the thin upper air. And you were left with an aircraft that could do something almost nothing else could: convert raw kinetic energy into altitude in a way that defied the published numbers. The men who flew it knew this in their bones. They knew, because they had done it, that the official ceiling was a fiction. Pilots spoke quietly of zoom climbs that took the aircraft to heights it had no business reaching, 80,000 feet, 87, beyond, to the very edge of space, where the sky went dark and the controls turned to mush and the engines gulped uselessly at air too thin to burn. One Lightning pilot, David Room, had once chased a high-flying RB-57 to 80,000 feet and flown past it before running out of sky. These were not the things the performance manuals advertised. They were the open secret of the squadrons, the trick the Lightning kept up its sleeve. So when a U-2 turned up in the 1984 NATO exercise, drifting along at 66,000 feet in the comfortable certainty of its own invulnerability, it presented Mike Hale with an irresistible challenge. The Dragon Lady's whole tactical value rested on a single proposition: that it flew where fighters could not follow. The U-2 community treated that altitude band as sacrosanct, a place to loiter and observe in perfect safety. It was, in the language of the exercise, considered safe from interception. Hale did not believe it. What made the moment so charged was everything stacked behind it. Here was the meeting of the two halves of Britain's Cold War: the secret aircraft the nation had helped to fly, and the home-built interceptor the nation had nearly cancelled, brought together over the grey North Sea in a contest nobody had scripted. Hale's Lightning, XR749, was about to test whether the most exotic spy plane in the Western arsenal really was beyond reach, or whether its safety was an illusion that the right pilot, in the right machine, on the right day, could shatter. The radar controllers vectored him towards the contact. The U-2 droned on, high and serene and entirely unaware. Down below, Hale lit the afterburners, felt the familiar shove of the Avons in his back, and began to build the speed he would need for what came next, the speed he was about to throw away all at once in a gamble against gravity itself. The climb was about to begin, and in the thin air at the top of it, for just a few seconds, physics was going to be persuaded to do something it really ought not to have done. The technique was unforgiving, and Hale knew every step of it the way a surgeon knows an incision. First, the foundation. Get down to the tropopause, the boundary between the lower atmosphere and the stratosphere at around 36,000 feet, where the Avon engines breathed most efficiently and the Lightning could be coaxed to its absolute maximum speed. This was the launch pad. Everything depended on arriving at the base of the climb with the aircraft accelerated to the ragged edge of its envelope, Mach 2 and beyond, the airframe singing, every available knot of energy banked and ready to be spent. Then the controller's geometry. A zoom intercept is not a chase. It is an ambush in 3 dimensions. There is no question of catching the U-2 in level flight. The Lightning cannot live at that height for more than a breath. Instead, the fighter must be flung upwards along a precise ballistic arc, timed and aimed so that the very apex of its parabola, the single instant where it hangs nearly motionless, energy spent before gravity reclaims it, coincides exactly with the position of the target. Get the timing wrong by a few seconds and you arc up through empty sky whilst the U-2 sails past untouched. There is no loiter, no circling back. The fuel does not allow it. Hale committed. He hauled the nose up, and the Lightning stood on its tail and climbed as nothing else in the sky could climb, 20,000 feet a minute and more, the altimeter unwinding upwards in a blur, the brutal acceleration of two Avons in full reheat, pressing him into the seat. 40,000 feet. 50. The blue outside the canopy began to deepen, to drain towards the violet black of the upper stratosphere. 60,000. Now the air was too thin for the engines to give their best, and the climb became a matter of momentum alone, the aircraft coasting up the invisible track of its own kinetic energy, slowing, the controls growing vague and mushy as the airflow over them thinned to almost nothing. And there, impossibly, gloriously, out of the canopy, the U-2. The Dragon Lady, that long-winged ghost, sat above its supposedly sacred 66,000 feet, and the lightning came rising up towards it out of the dark below like something that had no right to exist. For a few suspended seconds at the top of his arc, Hale held the fighter in the U-2's own domain, the gun camera running, capturing frame after frame of the spy plane that wasn't supposed to be catchable. He had done it. He had taken a 1950s interceptor the politicians had tried to kill and used it to stalk and kill the highest flying aircraft in the Western world in its own private patch of sky. The records from that and related flights tell the rest of the astonishing tale. In XR 749, Hale was logged climbing to a zoom height of around 88,000 feet, better than 16 miles above the Earth, an altitude that brushed the threshold of space, far above where any sane performance table said a Lightning could go. The U-2 crew, the story goes, were frankly gobsmacked. Astonished that a British fighter could appear, however briefly, in the rarefied air they had always regarded as theirs alone. It was a triumph measured in seconds, and it could not last. The energy was spent. The nose dropped, the controls bit again as the aircraft fell back into thicker air and Hale rode his fighter back down towards the world, fuel gauges falling, the intercept complete. On the gun camera, film was the proof. The Dragon Lady, framed and held by an aircraft that should never have got near her. But what did it actually prove? That is where the story turns from spectacle to substance. A gun camera frame is a seductive thing. It looks like a verdict. In truth, it was an argument, and the argument cut both ways. Take the triumph first because it was real. Hale's intercept demonstrated, in front of NATO witnesses, that the U-2's cherished altitude sanctuary was not absolute. A sufficiently bold pilot in a sufficiently brutal aircraft could violate it, however fleetingly. For the Royal Air Force, this was a quiet vindication of an aeroplane Whitehall had spent 30 years trying to apologize for. The 1957 Sandys White Paper had all but declared the manned interceptor dead. The Treasury had begrudged every Lightning ever built. And here was that supposedly obsolete machine doing something no missile and no other fighter in the alliance could match. There was real institutional satisfaction in that. A sense that the engineers at Wharton had built better than their political masters had ever deserved. But the cold professional reading was more sobering, and the men who flew the Lightning understood it perfectly. A zoom intercept is a stunt in the most precise and unsentimental sense of the word. It buys you a few seconds at the top of a ballistic arc in an aircraft that is by then barely flying, engines starved, controls slack, speed bleeding away, fuel critically short. You cannot maneuver. You cannot follow. You cannot, in any meaningful sense, fight. Against a passive target, drifting in a straight line, on a known track, in a scripted exercise, with ground controllers feeding you a perfect intercept geometry, it works. Against a U-2 that knew you were coming and simply turned away, or against the real nightmare, a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft or a high-flying bomber taking active evasive action, the whole beautiful parabola becomes useless. You arc up through the spot the target used to occupy, and you fall back down with nothing. This was the genuine lesson, and it was not flattering to anyone's romanticism. The Lightning's extraordinary climb was a magnificent party trick that papered over deep and worsening deficiencies. The aircraft's fuel endurance had always been a standing joke and a serious operational liability. A fighter that could be airborne for well under an hour, forever anxious about the tankers. Its radar was short-ranged. Its missiles, the Firestreak and Red Top, grew sluggish and unreliable in the thin upper air where the intercept actually took place. The Lightning could get there, yes, but it could barely do anything once it arrived, and it could not stay. And there was the larger strategic truth lurking behind the spectacle. By 1984, the high-altitude subsonic spy plane was already yielding to better tools. The Americans had the SR-71 Blackbird, which simply flew too high and too fast for any of this to matter, and increasingly they had reconnaissance satellites orbiting serenely beyond the reach of any fighter, zoom climb or no. The contest Hale had so brilliantly won was, in the grand scheme, a contest that was quietly becoming irrelevant. The U-2 itself would soldier on for decades, but the duel between high-flying aircraft and the fighters sent to catch them was being overtaken by machines in space. So what did Britain lose? And what did Britain learn? It lost nothing that day but a little of the U-2 community's complacency. What it learned, or rather, had confirmed, was the hard limit of brilliance without depth. The Lightning was a superb instrument playing a single, narrowing note. It could astonish, it could not endure. And in that gap between the spectacle and the substance lay the whole predicament of British air power in the late Cold War. World-class engineering, straightened means, and a strategic landscape shifting beneath everyone's feet. The gun camera film went into the records. The exercise ended, and the deeper questions it raised did not go away. The Lightning did not have long left, and everyone knew it. By the mid-1980s, its replacement was already in service, the Panavia Tornado F.3, a thoroughly modern interceptor born of a European collaboration between Britain, West Germany, and Italy, longer-legged, better censored, designed to loiter far out over the North Sea and the Iceland-Faroes Gap, killing Soviet bombers with long-range missiles before they ever came near British airspace. Where the Lightning was a sprinter that could barely stay airborne, the Tornado was a marathon runner built to patrol. It was, in every measurable respect, the more useful weapon for the war the RAF actually expected to fight. And yet the changeover carried an unmistakable melancholy, because everyone who flew the Lightning understood that something irreplaceable was being lost along with its deficiencies. The last Lightnings were retired from frontline RAF service in 1988. The squadron stood down, the aircraft dispersed to museums and gate guardians and the scrapyard. XR-749 itself, Hale's mount, the fastest Lightning in the fleet, ended its days as a gate guardian in Scotland, a silent monument to an afternoon over the North Sea when it touched the edge of space. The aircraft that could climb like nothing on Earth went quietly into history, just as the Cold War it had been built to fight entered its final act. For the special relationship, the U-2 episode and the long secret history behind it left a particular residue. Britain's clandestine partnership in the Dragon Lady program, Macmillan's quiet bargain, the dead squadron leader Walker, the forged Met Office identities, The decades of denial in Parliament had been a study in the peculiar intimacy of Anglo-American intelligence cooperation. Britain offered bases, deniability, skilled pilots, and political cover. America offered access to intelligence Britain could never have gathered alone. It was a relationship of profound asymmetry conducted between supposed equals, and the U-2 was one of its purest expressions. By the time Hale made his intercept, that secret partnership was decades old, and the files that documented it would stay locked away until well into the 21st century, when a reluctant Ministry of Defense finally let the public learn what their governments had done in the dark. The strategic balance, meanwhile, was tilting decisively towards space. The aircraft versus aircraft duel at high altitude, the very contest Hale had won so spectacularly, was being rendered obsolete by reconnaissance satellites that flew beyond the reach of any interceptor and any zoom climb. The future of seeing belonged to orbit. The U-2 would adapt and survive, astonishingly, into the present century, flying missions over conflicts its designers never imagined. But the romance of the high-altitude chase, the lone fighter flung at the edge of the atmosphere to catch the unreachable spy plane, was ending. Hale's intercept was less a beginning than a magnificent epitaph. One of the last times that particular kind of contest would ever be staged, and very nearly the only time it would be won so emphatically. What endured was the demonstration itself, the proof, captured on film, that British engineering and British nerve could together achieve something the published figures and the official ceilings flatly denied was possible. It became a touchstone story in the RAF's institutional memory. The day a condemned interceptor caught the uncatchable. Pilots told it. Engineers cherished it. And it spoke to something deeper about how Britain had fought the whole Cold War. Punching above its weight, extracting extraordinary performance from limited means, finding in skill and audacity what it could no longer afford in sheer scale, which is the real legacy of that gun camera frame. And the thought worth carrying away. There is a temptation, with stories like this, to leave it as pure spectacle, the plucky British fighter that caught the unbeatable spy plane, a music hall turn with afterburners. But the episode deserves better than that, because it captures in a single climbing arc almost everything about Britain's place in the Cold War world. Consider what had to be true for that gun camera frame to exist. A nation that could no longer afford to be a superpower had nonetheless built one of the finest interceptors of its age, and then spent 30 years half regretting it. A nation that had been quietly and deniably entangled with the very spy plane its fighter now hunted, bound to America in a secret partnership that ran from Downing Street through MI6 and cost at least one good man his life. A pilot trained to extract from an aging machine a performance its makers had never officially promised, and an entire defense posture built on the same fundamental bet: that British skill, British engineering, and British nerve could close the gap that British wealth and British scale could no longer cover. The Lightning's zoom climb was that bet made visible, brilliant, audacious, and quietly unsustainable. That, in the end, is the deeper truth the story tells about Britain's role in the world after empire. It was a country learning to do extraordinary things with diminishing means, to find in cleverness and courage what it had lost in raw power, to remain, by sheer determination and skill, in rooms its diminished resources no longer entitled it to enter. The intercept off the North Sea coast was a small, almost private triumph, witnessed by a handful of controllers and one very surprised American. But it stands as a near-perfect miniature of the whole British Cold War. Punching above our weight, extracting genius from constraint, and occasionally, against all the published figures, touching the edge of space. The U-2 flies still, more than 70 years after it first took to the air. The Lightning is gone, scattered to museums and plinths. XR 749 standing silent in a Scottish wind. But the moment those two aircraft met, high over the cold, grey water, distilled an entire era. The secret partnerships, the engineering brilliance, the strategic anxieties, the romance, and the limitation of it all, into a few frames of black and white film. It was the day Britain caught something it wasn't supposed to be able to catch, in an aircraft it wasn't supposed to still need, flown by a man who simply refused to believe the rules. What do you make of it? Was the Lightning a magnificent dead end? Brilliant engineering chasing a strategic problem that satellites were already solving? Or was that audacious zoom climb exactly the kind of bold, improvisational genius that kept Britain a serious military power long after the arithmetic said it shouldn't have been? I'd genuinely like to know where you land, so tell me in the comments below. If you enjoy this kind of history, the secret operations, the forgotten aircraft, the moments where British nerve met Cold War danger, then do subscribe. Give this one a like to help others find it, and I'll see you in the next one.